Most Christian churches, and you may have had this in your own background and experience, Palm Sunday traditionally occasions a kind of pious procession around the sanctuary, right, with cute children waving palm fronds. Um, I guess that's okay. At least it gets folk up and out of their pews for once. But we have to admit it's pretty sentimentalized. It's almost as if this story took place in Disneyland. So I want to talk this morning about replacing this famous story in its real world landscape in order to understand the politics of Jesus. So let's begin with a little bit of context. We're drawing here from Luke's version of the Jesus story. Um, and his account of the entry into Jerusalem is the longest of our synoptic gospel uh, accounts. So a few quick notes about that. This entry into Jerusalem culminates the main plot of the second half of Luke's story of Jesus, which is Jesus' long journey from Galilee in the north, steadily south, ending up in the capital city for a final showdown with the powers. He is, in essence, moving from the margins of Palestinian society to its center. This plot really demonstrates why Jesus' ministry was perceived as sufficiently subversive by the local and imperial authorities of occupied Palestine that they felt compelled to execute him. So this segment sequence culminates in Jesus' parable of the pounds, which is an autobiographical tale about how Jesus' resistance to the domination system would inevitably result in a fatal clash with the authorities. So let's pick up the story in Luke 19, verse 28. You just read this a little earlier, where Jesus comes from Jericho. He's coming in from the east. He arrives at the village of Bethany, about a mile and a half to the east of Jerusalem. And there he prepares to enter the holy city, but not as a reverent pilgrim demonstrating his allegiance to the temple system, but as a prophet challenging the very foundations of state power. Indeed, I would contend that Jesus' so-called triumphal entry into Jerusalem is kind of a misnomer for several reasons. For one thing, Luke's version of the story omits the hosannas and the palms, uh, which suggests that maybe these aren't the most important parts of the parade, even though it seems to be the only thing that we Christians focus on. For another thing, this carefully choreographed public demonstration is actually designed to repudiate messianic triumphalism. So come with me and let's take a closer look at this text. Now, a couple things to note about Jesus' approach. First, he goes up the far side of the Mount of Olives, verse 29. The village of Bethphage is thought to have been located in the southeastern slope of the mount. And then a few verses later, he descends on the Jerusalem side of the mountain. Now, understand that the Mount of Olives has always been an important feature in Jerusalem's landscape. From the third millennium before the Common Era until the present, this 3,000-foot hill has served as one of the main burial grounds for the city, among other things. So that's the setting of the story. What about the plot? Well, over half of Luke's narrative here is devoted to some curious instructions shown here. This scene is uncharacteristically detailed and it's repetitious. The entire scenario is repeated twice, even though the second repetition was omitted in your reading. So this gives the distinct impression that everything is being deliberately choreographed, maybe implying even that some street code is being used by the underground movement. So this plot strengthens my contention that the march that is about to start has been strategically planned as political. So here's the instructions on the cold. Everybody's seeing that. That's great. So it turns out that this setting and this plot are highly symbolic. And both the setting and the plot, the mountain and the donkey, would have brought to mind to biblically literate people two oracles from the prophet Zechariah. Launching a parade from the Mount of Olives alludes to the final apocalyptic battle between Israel and her enemies, spoken of here in Zechariah 14. This insinuation would have heightened the political tensions of the parade by invoking long-standing Judean hopes that their God would finally come and liberate them from their enemies. From their enemies. Well, that could have only meant one group, and that was without a doubt the occupying Roman army. The rule of the Roman Empire was absolute, not least in Palestine, a peripheral territory of the Pax Romana, where heavily armed legions kept things locked down, especially in Jerusalem. I always like to show this 3rd century legionnaire dedication plaque from a different periphery of the empire. The inscription is flanked by 2 relief carvings. At left is Mars, the Roman war god, brandishing a spear, while at right, the mythological hero Hercules holds his club. This is the propaganda of empire. Its message: do not mess with Rome, because we will beat you down. But an earlier oracle of Zechariah's has already qualified how this great final battle will be waged. In chapter 9, verse 8 of the prophet, he promises an end to oppression for God's people. Nothing ever again shall overrun them. 9:8. But the next verse famously introduces a messianic leader mounted not on a war stallion, but humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Now you see where Jesus is going with all these symbolics. And third, the next verse envisions an end to all violence and war. So if the Mount of Olives signaled the final struggle, the Zechariah donkey functioned to undermine any military fantasies that ancient readers may have harbored. Jesus was a nonviolent Messiah. And Luke wants to make sure that we understand that the disciples have gone to great lengths to procure this donkey as the central prop of the street theater. Pretty genius, eh? But this nonviolent symbolism doesn't lessen the thoroughly political nature of the parade, which now commences. Each detail in Luke's account invokes more memories of Israelite sovereignty. For example, the people laying their garments on the road recalled the insurgent declaration of Jehu as an upstart king back in 2 Kings 9. This is centuries before. The donkey, meanwhile, also signified the ancient triumph of the tribe of Judah, a vision that goes way back to Genesis 49. So this donkey is not just a ride for Jesus. It represents a symbolic fulfillment of the ancient Israelite dreams of freedom. It's tantamount to a declaration of independence or of Jewish lives matter. That's some pretty powerful street theater. Perhaps an analogy will help bring this home. Let's say in the American story, the Boston Tea Party of 1773. Obviously, this was a symbolic action by American colonists that was addressing both a specific tax that they saw as economically odious, but also the broader political question of overseas rule. Now, this public theater even had costuming. Did you know that many of the Sons of Liberty, as the group called itself, dressed up as Mohawk warriors? This was meant to show the English that these folks identified as Americans rather than as subjects of Great Britain. Mohawk face paint. How ironic is that? Given that these same colonial settlers would soon go to war against the real Mohawk Confederacy. Of course, it's a whole other story, but it does give me the opportunity to, at the midpoint here, shamelessly plug our new book that David mentioned earlier on discipleship as decolonization, which has come out since the last time we talked with one of the churches here. So you can get the book here at this URL, healinghauntedhistories.org. And we do hope that some of you at the Jesus Collective will want to join a study group to work through this material that is so relevant to those of us living today on Chumash territory with so many issues of justice. Well, back to Luke. If the donkey and the cloaks weren't enough, the chants that arise as Jesus descends the Mount of Olives seals this parade as political theater. These sloganeering shouts echo the royal processional and coronation hymn of Psalm 118, as you see here, further intensifying the crisis over legitimate authority in Israel in Jesus' time. But they also allude to more recent notorious events. They recall the victorious military procession of Simon Maccabeus, the famous guerrilla Jewish general who liberated Palestine from Hellenistic rule some 2 centuries before Luke wrote. Simon entered Jerusalem, according to 1 Maccabees, quote, with praise and palm branches and with hymns and songs. And on top of that, there had been an incident of messianic posturing at the beginning of the Judean revolt against Rome, only a generation before Luke wrote. According to the Jewish historian Josephus, the guerrilla captain Menahem had marched through Jerusalem heavily armed like a king in an unsuccessful attempt to become the sole leader of the rebel provisional government. Now, I know, friends, that's a lot of historical detail, but remember, we're trying to replace the gospel stories in real life, to rescue it from Disneyland, to bring it down to earth. And these uprisings I've just talked about would have been front page news that long lingered in the memory of an oppressed people. Kind of like us invoking Martin Luther King at the Lincoln Memorial or Cesar Chavez in Delano. On top of all that, Roman sovereignty is being challenged in the crowd's declaration, peace in heaven and glory in the highest. After all, this is exactly what the angels had proclaimed to the peasant shepherds at the birth of Jesus at the beginning of Luke's story. You know, that's a story we tell at Christmas. This phrase clearly means to usurp Roman propaganda. You see, it was customary for Roman poets and bards to declare peace and prosperity at the birth of the one who was to become emperor. But here in the New Testament, it's not the Pax Romana being proclaimed in this Palm Sunday parade. No, it's a decidedly Israelite messianic vision of peace and good and sovereignty. Understand that this kind of loaded rhetoric would not have been lost on Jesus' contemporaries, both Jewish and Roman. Well, wait, there's more. Marcus Borg and Dom Crossan, 2 New Testament scholars, in their 2006 book, The Last Week, a day-to-day account of Jesus' final week, argue that there were likely 2 processions into Jerusalem during this Passover week. The high holy days were always, after all, a volatile time in Jerusalem because the Jews were celebrating their deliverance from the Egyptian empire past, even though they currently lived under the Roman boot. Oh, the Roman authorities knew that nationalist Jews would get all riled up again during Passover with all that talk about freedom from bondage. So Jesus was entering the city from the east. Meanwhile, a military cavalry led by the Roman governor Pilate was arriving in the city from the west, bringing in troops to the city to quell any overzealous Jews who might be calling for revolt. Now, we need to also consider how this Roman military procession was also a different kind of political theater. It was called a Triumphus. It was a public celebration sanctifying the military victories of imperial commanders. The general wore regalia, identifying him as nearly divine, and rode in a chariot through the streets of Rome in procession with the army and the spoils of war. It is this spectacle, by the way, of imperial domination that the writer of Colossians later parodies. portraying rather the risen Christ, parading the principalities and powers who have been defeated by his cross. A deeply ironic and subversive image. A depiction of this military triumphus is still visible today on the Arch of Titus, which you can see today in Rome. It was constructed 2,000 years ago in the year 82 of the Common Era by the Emperor Domitian to commemorate Titus' victories, including his siege of Jerusalem a decade earlier, which was when the last vestiges of Jewish sovereignty collapsed. This arch would have been roughly contemporaneous with the writing of the Gospel of Luke. This panel on that arch shows Roman soldiers marching into Rome with the spoils of war, including all of the riches from the sacked Jewish temple in Jerusalem. Notice the giant menorah. Obviously, for Jews, these were monuments to terror and to trauma, not unlike Confederate statues in the South today. So make no mistake, Roman soldiers marching into West Jerusalem during Passover week was a show of force meant to intimidate any opposition to their colonial occupation, something that is sadly all too familiar and still happens in that very city to quell contemporary dissent with tragic consequences. In light of all this, we can imagine that Jesus was staging a kind of counter demonstration. Pilate rides into West Jerusalem on a war horse, threatening intimidation. Jesus into East Jerusalem on a borrowed donkey, offering liberation. The procurator proclaims the Pax Romana, the Nazarene a Pax Christi, riding an animal who symbolized both sovereignty, but also the prophetic promise that Yahweh would one day banish the war horse forever. And that, I contend, is pretty subversive stuff. No wonder then that some of the local Judean authorities tried to silence the crowds, wishing to avoid a political scene. How often in the history of our churches or nation have cautious leaders tried to suppress hope that was rising among marginalized folk who are getting fired up in the streets. Oh yeah, this is a very contemporary story. Jesus' response to the authorities is sharp and pointed. It concludes this story, and it is actually Luke's unique addition to the Markan account of the entry into Jerusalem. The image of the stones crying out alludes to, you guessed it, another oracle from another prophet, in this case, Habakkuk, which critiques the elites who would build trophy homes on the back of oppressed labor, so that, according to the prophet, the very stones cry out from the walls of your trophy homes. So let us note that Jesus is marching with the people in the streets rather than criticizing them from insular boardrooms or pulpits. Well, there's more to Luke's account of that first great Palm Sunday protest, especially his poignant report of Jesus weeping over Jerusalem, which follows. But in the interest of time, I'll stop here. Let me conclude by just quickly noting several experiences I've had with contemporary expressions of Palm Sunday demonstrations for peace and justice, in which Christians take their faith from the sanctuary out into the streets in public liturgy. For example, the Nevada desert experienced the Sacred Peace Walk. It's a 65-mile annual pilgrimage to the Nevada National Security Tests, where the U.S. tests its nuclear weapons. It goes from Palm Sunday to Good Friday, and I actually helped get the first one going when I was in seminary back in the 1980s, and have participated in these marches in support of indigenous Shoshone sovereignty in Nevada several times. So that's one example. Another one happens closer, just down in Pasadena, where Elaine and I helped get started the Pasadena Palm Sunday Peace Parade. This is a tradition been going almost 20 years. It was birthed out of Pasadena Mennonite Church in response to the Second Gulf War. You see, there's lots to march against in a militarized state. Last year, friends in Australia marched on Palm Sunday for refugee rights. This year, our colleagues at Clergy and Laity United for Economic Justice are at the Adelanto detention facility supporting immigrant detainees as we speak. But most poignantly today, I'm thinking of friends who are still trying to find justice in Palestine. I had the privilege of being part of 2 Palm Sunday weekend demonstrations back in 2012. On Friday, while we were in East Jerusalem, there was a huge pitched battle at the Israeli checkpoint down in Bethlehem, with people climbing on the walls and tear gas and lots of drama. Meanwhile, we were at the Damascus gate of the old city of Jerusalem, and there was a dramatic clash between Palestinian protesters and Israeli police that went on for hours, with concussion grenades and charging horses and water cannons, and of course, scores of Palestinians being arrested or carried away on stretchers. You see, then, like in the New Testament, police violence was meant to remind everybody of who's in charge. As we negotiated the constantly migrating ebb and flow of violence, I received a gripping reality check concerning what our friends are up against. I narrowly dodged one of the police surges and ducked a flying rock, only to see my friend Omar Harame, the staff of Sabeel Center for Liberation Theology, standing between the police and several old women with pictures of their slain sons. He, of course, was the one who was arrested, and we later had to bail him out of jail. The very next day, we marched from Gethsemane toward the old city of Jerusalem as part of the annual Christian Palm Sunday parade from the Mount of Olives, just like in the old story. It takes place under the watchful eye of security forces, just like the first Palm Sunday. You see, Jerusalem is still an occupied city if you are Palestinian. Indeed, many Christians cannot even come here, though they live right close by, because they can't get a permit or a pass. Still, there's something deeply moving about the waves of Christians of all types and ages and countries joyously parading up and into the old city. On this one day, Palestinian Christians can march proudly en masse and say, "We are not going away. This is our city and our country too. Palestinian Christian lives matter." So, friends, whenever we march for justice in our very small and symbolic fashion, we're doing nothing more or less than following in the footsteps of Jesus. As we've seen in today's gospel, Jesus pitted his vision of God's beloved community against Roman imperialist ideologies in a very strategic and public manner. Not only that, we're also marching in the footsteps of our greatest American prophet, Martin Luther King Jr. On Palm Sunday, 1959, Dr. King preached a watershed sermon at Dexter Avenue Church, in which he laid out why Christians need to embrace the nonviolent direct action politics of Gandhi. Subsequently, King's most famous march from Selma to Montgomery became what is now considered the political and emotional peak of the modern civil rights movement. It began with the infamous merciless police beatings of Bloody Sunday on March 7th, 1965, and was completed on March 21st, 3 weeks before Palm Sunday, 25,000 people strong. Beloved, this year, Easter falls on the 53rd anniversary of the execution of Martin Luther King Jr. After a lifetime of protest marches and speaking truth to power in apartheid America, Dr. King was assassinated just 3 days shy of Palm Sunday. So let us remember him and his movement on the Feast of Resurrection next Sunday, because so many of the issues King struggled against continue to plague our country. And may we Christians work to decolonize Palm Sunday, embracing it as a call to move, like Dr. King, from the sanctuary to the streets, just as our gospel story invites. Amen.